So what is intelligence? Is it one thing or a lot of different things? If it is a lot of different things, what are those different things? Those are the questions we're turning to now. The major proponent of the idea that intelligence is one thing, in other words, that it makes sense to say, oh, he's smart because intelligence is one thing, is this guy, Charles Spearman. And Spearman spent a lot of time looking at correlations or associations between different measures of performance or intelligence. So if you'll recall back from our statistics lecture, correlations can be strong or weak. If one factor is perfectly predicted from another factor, then we could say that their correlation is 1. If there's no relationship between the two factors, then we can say that its correlation is 0. What Spearman found was a very small but consistent correlation between different measures of intelligence. So if you analyze report cards from kids, there is a small correlation between grades in different classes. In other words, not everybody, not by a long shot, but for a few people consistently, there's a relationship between the grade that they got in their math class and the grade that they got in their English class. That small correlation, Spearman called G for general intelligence. G for general intelligence. Now, Spearman was a guy who said his intelligence is one thing, and he proved it. But he later changed his mind and said, well, actually, there is one kind of general intelligence, but there is also a lot of separate, smaller, specific types of intelligence. For example, some people are really great at solving spatial problems, and other people are terrible at spatial problems, but they're great at language and linguistic tests. So Spearman, the guy who said that intelligence is one thing, even he came back later and said that there are other types of intelligence, but they're just less important. People who argued for general intelligence had this problem that they had to deal with. And the problem is age. It turns out that younger people are able to think about a lot of things more quickly and more deeply than people my age, which may make you wonder, why is it that you're taking this class from me and I'm not taking it from you? But we'll put that aside for a minute. What researchers found is there's a kind of ability to hold a lot of different pieces of information in memory and work with them all at the same time. We call that working memory. And younger people have far superior working memory capacity. They can hold more information and work with it than older people. Also, younger people can solve problems more quickly than older people. So the single intelligence people said, well, okay, single intelligence, there's 2 types of single intelligence. Wait, now where 1 is 2, and starting to sound like a biblical argument. One type of intelligence is this fluid intelligence that peaks when you're in your 20s, as shown by the blue line in this graph. And then there's another kind of intelligence that, what do you know, old professors developed the concept for, and that's essentially wisdom. And the idea there is, as we get older, sure, we can't hold as much in working memory, and sure, we can't answer problems as quickly as younger people, but we have perspective, we have wisdom, we have another kind of intelligence. I'm going to tell you briefly about a few researchers who argued for the idea that intelligence is a number of different things. The first one is Thurstone, and he was a very active critic of Spearman, the guy who argued for one type of intelligence. Thurstone argued that there's actually, seven types of intelligence, and they include things like spatial ability and memory, and your ability to use numbers, your ability to use language, and later, a researcher named Howard Gardner came up with another theory of multiple types of intelligence. And he argued that there were not 7 types of intelligence, but 8, and that each type of intelligence was relatively independent of the other ones. So, for example, one of his types of intelligence was music, right? So, Stravinsky. Another type of intelligence could be body intelligence or kinesthetic intelligence. And people could argue that LeBron James and Kobe Bryant are geniuses in bodily kinesthetic intelligence. Sigmund Freud, who we'll talk about next month, could be understood as a genius when it came to self-reflection and self-analysis. So different types of intelligence, and we all have a little bit of some and not so much of another. More recently, Bob Sternberg has developed a theory of intelligence that boils it down to just 3 types. And the 3 types are your ability to analyze information, your ability to create, and your street smarts. Sternberg argued that everyone has all 3 types of intelligence, but we're generally strongest in one type of intelligence. And Sternberg argued that intelligence is not something you're born with, it's something that you develop, that you nurture. It's all about environment. So, is intelligence one thing or many different things? Well, it depends. Maybe both. So some people argue that intelligence is just one thing because there are these correlations between these different subtypes of intelligence, and maybe that thing that results is intelligence. But there's a lot of evidence that there are different types of intelligence. So there could be both. Either way, you have to ask yourself the question, where does intelligence come from? Are you born smart or do you become smart? Well, people still argue about this too. Measures of how much intelligence comes from our genes vary dramatically. Some people argue that almost all of our intelligence is innate or genetically determined, and other people argue that our intelligence is primarily created, that just a small amount of intelligence is genetic. I'm going to focus on the nurture or environmental aspects of intelligence for a reason that you'll see very shortly. Well, let's start here, for example. Research with rats has shown, using experimental methods, that all sorts of environmental factors impact intelligence. So, for example, do you see these 2 drawings of boxes in there? If you raise a rat or a hamster in a box that has a lot of activities for the rat or hamster to interact with, and maybe has fellow animals for them to play with and have social interactions with, those rats, the rats in the complex environment, will be smarter than the rats in the very simple environment. Turns out we also find correlational evidence for this in humans. So children who are raised in stimulating environments and in which there's a lot of things for them to explore and questions to ask and tools to manipulate, they tend to have more intelligence later in life than children who grow up in environments where there's no toys, there's very little to do, there's no stimulation. Nutrition plays a huge role in intelligence. If you are not getting a balanced and nutritious diet, then there's a very good chance, especially if you're a child, that your intelligence is going to suffer for that. So malnourished children often have cognitive difficulties. Maternal stress. It turns out that if, while your mother was pregnant with you, she experienced a great deal of stress, not unlike the stress associated with the current times, right? Could be stresses due to war, poverty, pandemic, political cuckoo-ness. Maternal stress can impact the intelligence of a child. Maternal age influence is related to child intelligence. It turns out that older mothers are sort of a jackpot for kids because the children of older mothers tend to have higher IQs. On the other hand, there's a risk to having an older mother, and that is Down syndrome. And people with Down syndrome often have cognitive limitations. If you are exposed to pollutants, alcohol, fetal alcohol syndrome, lead or gas, traffic pollution, all of that carbon, all of these types of pollution impact a child's intellectual development. But the thing that really gets me the most for intelligence is this. It's something called the Flynn effect. And in my mind, the Flynn effect takes any idea of a genetic determination of intelligence and pretty much throws it out the window. Okay. I told you that the IQ test is always set so that the average IQ equals 100. Well, it turns out that the people who do IQ testing have to work really hard to make that happen. Because if they didn't adjust the average IQ to be 100 every year, then what you would see is the average intelligence every decade, every year, is getting higher. In other words, according to the Flynn effect, you are smarter than your parents, and your parents are smarter than their parents, and their parents, your grandparents, are smarter than your great-grandparents. And the difference is dramatic. So 1920. I recognize that this is 100 years ago, but my parents were born in the 1920s. They were very smart people, but according to this chart, if IQ tests were given in the 1920s, the average IQ was actually about 75. And remember that I said that IQs between 50 and 70 peg someone at about the functioning level of a sixth grader. If genetics were in control of our intelligence, then the Flynn effect could never exist because genetics does not change this quickly. So something is dramatically increasing intelligence all around the world. And what are those things? Well, better nutrition, less pollution, better access to education. Think about all the things that you know because of the internet, things that your grandparents couldn't have known at your age, right? In the old days, if you wanted to find something out, you went to the library and you took a book off the shelf and you looked through it. It was much harder to find information than it is now. Come right back and we'll have our last segment on intelligence.